Vagankovo Cemetery in central Moscow dates from the 1700s. Picture tens of thousands of ornate graves under a canopy of birch and linden trees. In Soviet times, it was a popular burial place for members of the artistic, military and scientific elite. Most visitors to Vagankovo are relatives. Others are tourists, visiting famous graves like those of Soviet folk singers Vladimir Vysotsky and Bulat Akudjava. But one day in May 2022, Igor Yakovlev was on a very different kind of mission. Igor walked and walked through the cemetery, searching for the stone he knew must be there. When he finally reached the gravesite he was looking for, a chill ran down his spine. Not because of the name on the stone, but because it turned out he wasn't alone.
There
were people already there, I guess relatives. 2 men were sitting by the grave, drinking vodka. I couldn't bring myself to go up to them. I just couldn't.
What do you say to the descendants of a killer? In Russia, most people can trace their family history back to the victims and perpetrators of long-ago crimes. Crimes that echo through the generations. Crimes that still matter to people like Igor. Because, in this case, the victim wasn't just anybody. It was a member of Igor's own family, his great-great-grandfather to be precise. It may sound like a distant relative, but this story took place in the 1930s, just one parent or grandparent's lifetime away for many of us. Yefrem Palagin was arrested on fabricated charges during Stalin's terror. His family never saw him again. And now, Igor was standing by the grave of one of the secret policemen who'd done it, watching the man's descendants toast his memory. But instead of anger or despair, Igor felt something close to empathy.
I didn't feel any hatred toward them. I understood. They were visiting their ancestors' grave. I was the one who didn't belong there. They did. What they were doing, that was normal.
As well as his day job doing PR for one of Russia's marginalized liberal parties, Igor is an amateur historian and genealogist. For 8 years now, he's been building his family tree, tracking names and gathering documents. When asked why he's interested in the topic, he tends to reply to better understand his own country. In the years of relative freedom after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Igor's search for historical truth would have been straightforward. Search online, visit archives, consult experts, rinse and repeat. But amid Vladimir Putin's ever tighter embrace of authoritarianism, and especially since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, this has changed. From schools to bookstores and archives, the Russian government has moved aggressively to control the past, reshape it, and deploy its own version for political purposes. History has become a weapon to justify war, aggrandize the state, and stamp out dissent. Uncovering the fate of an ancestor, therefore, is a way to make sense of Putin's Russia.
The topic of political repression has been around pretty much the whole time Vladimir Putin has been in power. That's why finding out about this case became really important to me. Trying to make sense of repression today is difficult. It's easier to study what happened decades ago. It's documented, it's described.
Hello, and welcome to Russia Underground. I'm Howard Amos, a journalist who reported from Russia for nearly a decade. My co-host, Nina Berezna, a Russian citizen and political researcher, will join us in the next episode. Over 3 episodes, we'll explore what we're calling the fight against forgetting. What's being erased? How are ordinary people resisting? And what can people outside the country learn from the Russian experience? If the past is a battlefield, in recent years the state has been on the offensive, aggressively pushing some narratives and silencing others. Dozens of new Stalin statues have been erected across the country. The Nobel Prize-winning human rights organization Memorial, which documented Stalinist-era crimes, was shut down in 2021. And in late 2024, the Gulag History Museum in Moscow was shuttered by the authorities. The Kremlin has also mobilized the memory of World War II to justify its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Ukrainians were branded Nazis, and the Soviet victory banner, the one flying in that famous picture of the ruined Reichstag, was hoisted over destroyed Ukrainian towns and villages. While the Kremlin's version of history has fueled destruction in Ukraine, inside Russia its effect is deadening. Challenging the official narrative can get you fired, fined, or even imprisoned. Still, there are Russians trying to push back. This episode is about how ordinary Russians are turning to family history to tell true stories about the past and reveal uncomfortable narratives that challenge the party line. With everything that's going on today, such a hobby can seem frivolous. But as we'll see, amid restrictions on free expression, pursuing one's own family story has become a quietly subversive act, one that nurtures hope for a different kind of Russia. A note before we begin. The names of some of the people featured in this episode have been changed to protect their safety. Over 800 miles east of Moscow stands the city of Syktyvkar. It's the capital of Komi Republic, a remote region that, in the east, abuts the Ural Mountains. Komi has been shaped by its Soviet past and proximity to the Arctic. Long winters, drab concrete architecture, and wide, empty roads lined with birch and pine. In Stalinist times, Komi was a place of exile. People from as far away as the Baltic Sea were forcibly relocated here. One of them was a 12-year-old Lithuanian girl, Anita's grandmother. Anita had long wondered about her grandmother's experience. What had it been like for her to be rounded up with her family in 1941 and shipped in cattle trucks to central Russia?
In my family, we never really talked about this, and at some point I realized that I was living without a past, without any real connection to my family's story or its roots. And it felt important to reach for that history, to try and understand what happened to my relatives, especially because I live in Syktyvkar, the very place where many Lithuanians were deported. And yet, even here, people, adults, are surprised by my name.
On top of this, talking openly about Stalin's repressions remains difficult in Russia, perhaps particularly outside of Moscow. It's not always encouraged, in public, in schools, or even within families. It's not very fashionable. He won the war, people say of Stalin, and they don't want to hear about the other stuff, which makes these personal journeys into the past not just acts of remembrance, but quiet forms of resistance.
When my grandmother died, that was in 2020, I was 19, it hit me. I realized I had lost something, a whole part of our story. And now I'd never get it back. There was no one left to ask.
But there was something to read. A memoir her grandmother had left behind. Perhaps too fraught or dangerous to open, the book had been gathering dust.
Our relationship with my grandmother was complicated. I lived with my mom. My mom had locked away the memoirs my grandmother had written. She didn't really take them seriously. She just said, "Oh, your grandmother gave me these. I put them over there somewhere." And I didn't take them seriously either. My mom didn't have the heart to throw them away, but none of us intended to read them.
Reading them brought Anita closer to her grandmother than ever before.
I really enjoyed reading them, even though they're full of mistakes. But those mistakes, they're full of life. So much history is hidden behind them. It's not that she was just uneducated or forgetful. She only spoke Lithuanian until she was 12. She lived entirely in a Lithuanian environment. Then she was deported into a Russian-speaking world.
Anita was equally struck by what the memoirs didn't say. For example, they didn't contain a single mention of children's games. No hide and seek, no friends, none of the usual hallmarks of childhood. Every page of her grandmother's memories about growing up in a so-called special settlement for deportees was about survival.
In my grandmother's memoir, she wrote about how after winter, the kids would go out to collect leftover potatoes, the ones that hadn't been dug up before the frost.
One day, Anita set off to find the special settlement where her grandmother lived. Slabodsky Raid is about 40 minutes' drive from Syktyvkar. The narrowing road gives way to a dirt track that was once the main street of the village, where so-called enemies of the state like her grandmother lived. Now, it's just forest. Tree branches lean in from both sides. If you didn't know, you'd never guess that hundreds of people once lived here. Once upon a time, there were barracks, a kitchen, a bathhouse, and a clinic. A shed that became a morgue in winter. Today, there are no plaques, no remains of any houses, only silence.
It wasn't hard to find, actually. There are still maps that show its location. It's surprising, honestly shocking even, that a place so heavy with history is now just forest. If you stumbled upon it without knowing the past, you'd never understand what once happened here.
The story of a stolen childhood resonated deeply with Anita, and, being an artist, she turned her grandmother's suffering into art.
The project is called Hopscotch of Life, and it looks like a typical children's hopscotch game, but reimagined. I chose that image because my grandmother was deported as a child. And when I read her memoirs, I realized she never really had a childhood.
So, instead of a playful chalk hopscotch game, Anita created an installation out of rotting wood. Each square represented a year in exile, from ages 12 to 18. The whole piece was covered in earth and grass, a symbol of the fact that her grandmother's story was buried, forgotten by the Russian state. The grass, sprouting through the dirt, represented the rootless descendants of those who suffered from the Stalinist deportations. Anita's installation was shown in January 2025 at the Revolt Center, an independent cultural space in Syktyvkar that, since 2019, has been shedding light on the region's difficult history. Svetlana, a co-founder of Revolt, was the exhibition's curator.
We've always tried different ways to support the work of Komi's challenging legacy. The Komi Republic exists in its present form because of the Gulag system and the special settlements. The economy here was built on the backs of those settlements and camps. And even today, that system still shapes the region's economy.
In a country where statues of Stalin are reappearing, Svetlana wasn't sure whether the exhibition would strike a chord with the public. Would people even feel comfortable going? So she was astonished by the reception.
This was one of the most visited exhibitions we've ever had. We were so worried. Would people come? Would the exhibition be shut down? But it wasn't. People came. Children of those who grew up in special settlements came. Elderly people. And they thanked us.
Svetlana works closely with artists, and since the war in Ukraine, she's noticed they're becoming more cautious. Even when the topic isn't explicitly political, artists speak more and more through metaphors, symbolism, and indirect references. Being direct is risky. The Revolt Center was taking a risk by putting on such an exhibition. There are still a few independent cultural spaces in Russia willing to take these sorts of risks. Rather than a focus on individual stories of suffering, the Kremlin would like the history of this period to stress the great Soviet victory over Nazi Germany, portray Stalin's repressions as a minor blip on the road to an economic transformation, and emphasize that a strong hand in the Kremlin and powerful security services are essential to Russia's survival.
In my artist statement, I wrote that I have a real question about why these stories are being silenced, especially at the state level. And I was actually surprised that this sentence made it into the final description and that my artwork was displayed for a full 2 months with that description. I'm sure a state-run institution wouldn't have allowed it.
As we were putting together this podcast, we learned that Russia's security forces had caught up with the Revolt Center. In July, the FSB raided the center, as well as the homes of many people who worked there. They opened a criminal case against one of its co-founders, Pavel Andreev, accusing him of treason. The following month, the center and many of its staff were designated as foreign agents by the authorities, a label that entails onerous accounting obligations and carries connotations of espionage. Shortly after, the Revolt Center announced it was closing down permanently.
I've never been very drawn to big historical events, military victories, political intrigue, because I don't know how it is in other countries. But in Russia, history is the history of the state. It's the history of power, of wars, of politicians negotiating behind closed doors. That's not people's history, but genealogy. That's where the history of people lives.
This is Igor, the same person we heard from at the start of the episode. What he says here gets at something essential about genealogy. In authoritarian systems like the Soviet Union and in today's Russia, history has always been written from above. Wars, leaders, state power. Ordinary people are shunted to the margins, if they appear at all. But researching family history flips that script. It insists that every life matters. Every name, every photo, every half-forgotten story is worth recovering. And in a place where public history is tightly controlled, family history has become a kind of island of freedom. Not because it's encouraged, but because the state isn't really paying attention. There's little funding, no political benefit, no centralized surveillance of what people ask their grandmothers. And so, for now, people are still able to dig. Russia may look like an all-encompassing, authoritarian, even totalitarian regime from the outside. But inside, there are pockets where state control is incomplete. Family history is one of them. This helps to explain what researchers and genealogists say is a recent boom in people searching for their roots, in personal archives, ancestry, forgotten surnames. People are retreating inward, turning to the personal, because that still feels safe. It's one thing to talk about state violence in a public square. It's quite another to flip through old photos. Ekaterina is a professional family historian.
February 2022. That moment really hit people. Like, oh my God, what's happening? Suddenly people started asking, who am I? A lot of folks began wondering about their nationality. For all kinds of reasons. Some rushed to apply for repatriation, trying to remember every relative, every long-forgotten Lithuanian grandmother. Feelings came alive. Some finally started looking into their Jewish ancestry. People also say that during tough times, interest in the esoteric rises.
Igor believes that there is also now enough distance from the fear that ran through Soviet society. People can begin to address the pain and silences within their families.
First of all, we need to understand that in Soviet times, interest in one's ancestors, in family history, was taboo. It was seen as backward or even dangerous. You could discover, for example, that your ancestors belonged to wrong class: clergy, kulaks, nobility, officers, Cossacks, and that could bring serious consequences. That trauma still lives on, even in my generation. I'm a child of perestroika. I was born in 1986, under Gorbachev, and even I still feel that chill, that fear, somewhere inside.
But over time, with each generation that passes, the grip of that trauma loosens. It's no longer as sharp or paralyzing as it was for those who lived through it.
What I'm seeing now is that people are freer, less burdened by trauma, and that gives them more space to explore. Because being interested in your own story, that's normal. It's something people do everywhere in the world.
For years, no one in Igor's family knew what had happened to his great-great-grandfather, Yefrem. Whether he'd survived his arrest, whether he'd ever returned. Igor's first task became to try and recover Yefrem's life, a life that the state had tried to erase. Like many people in Russia who investigate their family histories, however, Igor's interest led him deeper into the history of repression, the Gulag system, and the ways Soviet citizens navigated life under authoritarian rule.
As I started digging deeper, I came face to face again with the horror of Stalinism. I remember thinking, when I want to explain to my kids or my nephews what Stalinism was, I'll tell this story.
Here's that story. In the state archives, Igor came across job applications submitted by Yefrem's children in the late 1930s and early 1940s. These forms asked for information about their parents. Looking through these forms, Igor kept discovering an error. Yefrem's children repeatedly claimed that their father had died several years before his actual death. They also falsely claimed he had simply been retired at the time of his death, not exiled, as was the case. Igor realized what they were doing. Knowing that association with an enemy of the people would doom their job applications, they were doctoring the past.
And that just stunned me. This instinct for self-preservation, it's understandable on a human level. But how do you bury your father, say he's dead, just to protect yourself? What kind of system do you have to be living in for someone to do that? And not under torture, just on a job application.
Igor did eventually find out what happened to Yefrem. Arrested for supposed counter-revolutionary activities in 1930, imprisoned in the frigid Arkhangelsk region, dead from tuberculosis in 1940. Yefrem was only cleared of all charges in 1989. But one mystery led to others. I said earlier that some families are descended from victims and some from victimizers, but it's not that simple, because some families, like Igor's, are descended from both. A dual legacy that resists simple categories. It turned out that Josef Berioza, the brother of Igor's great-grandfather, wasn't just a pen pusher in the secret police, or NKVD. He was one of the most senior NKVD officers in what's now Zabaikalsk Krai, a region of Siberia near the Chinese border. Josef worked in the NKVD's counterintelligence division during the height of the Great Terror in the late 1930s, overseeing Stalin's execution, jailing, and exiling of members of local ethnic groups. In particular, Josef was in charge of targeting Koreans and Chinese.
I learned how the interrogations were conducted, what these people went through. It was horrifying. These were crimes on par with what the Gestapo or SS did in Nazi Germany.
Igor found testimony from NKVD officers describing the brutal methods that were used, including night interrogations, psychological pressure, abuse, and torture. And he ended up reconstructing Josef's entire biography. Born in a remote village in southern Ukraine, Josef was apparently an intelligent, capable, and ambitious young man. In a different system, at a different time, he might have done anything. What he actually did was to move to Moscow, learn Mongolian, and get assigned to the secret police.
I'm not trying to justify him. I understand who he was. He was a complicated figure.
Igor runs a website where he publishes parts of the family history he's uncovered.
When I decided to publicly share the story of my great-granduncle, I had a difficult conversation with my mother. He was her great-uncle, and she knew his brother well, her grandfather. And for her, this wasn't just historical material. It was something deeply personal. She holds the family name Dia. It is her maiden name. And now, that name is stained with blood. But in the end, and I really respect her for this, she gave me her blessing. I'm very grateful for her wisdom and understanding. I know it wasn't easy.
Igor believes that the names of perpetrators of the crimes of Stalinism should be known, not just the names of the victims. He wrote a post in a Facebook group for Russian-speaking Koreans explaining what he'd learned, and offered to help anyone whose relatives had suffered. Some people thanked him or asked for help. Igor says not a single person sought to blame him. He still keeps in touch with some of them.
So it's a big misconception that there will be some kind of revenge for raking up the past, or that it will divide people. On the contrary, it can be a path to national reconciliation and to honest conversation, I think.
In other words, Igor sees his family history obsession as being part of a broader struggle for a different future for Russia. Even so, he sometimes can't help but think that his family history mission is irrelevant amid the horrors of the war in Ukraine and the ever-escalating repression inside Russia. But he believes processing the past can help people, including himself, find a way to navigate the present.
Honestly, I have to say that working in the archives, working with these documents, it completely drains me. Sometimes I just sit there and think, why am I doing this? Why? There's so much horror now that war has started again, and repression is again underway. Today, people are once again facing the sort of conditions that they faced in the Gulag. But those historical repressions, they are something you can return to when you have time and energy. They're not going anywhere. They have already happened. They are already in the past. And yes, it's kind of space where I can try to make sense of what's happening to me now, through the lens of what happened to earlier generations.
Even in today's Russia, there are still cracks in the system. If you know how to navigate them, small progress is possible. That's what Igor is trying to do. Because Igor isn't just a genealogist, he's also employed by the liberal Yabloko party that emerged in the 1990s and has now been consigned to Russia's political margins. And at the intersection of these two worlds, politics and family history, he had an idea. For years, he's seen how difficult it's become to access Soviet-era case files, especially those of people who were repressed but never officially rehabilitated. Often, the archives redact critical details, even when there's no legal base to do so.
Nowadays, I wouldn't be able to get my great-great-grandfather's file. Thankfully, back then, I paid quite a lot of money to have it fully scanned, so I have the complete file with all the names of the security officers, witnesses, informants, and the full interrogation protocols. But now, people complain that this information is being withheld. Here's the part that directly concerns your relatives, go ahead and read it. But the bit where the neighbor wrote a denunciation, they wouldn't show that. Why? Personal data, they say. What personal data? That person has been dead for nearly a century.
All this may seem baffling, even contradictory. While Russia is ramping up control of history, activists still somehow believe the Russian courts can order archives to open up. But the answer lies in how Russia operates. At the same time as being a brutal authoritarian regime, where one man's word is law, there is also a cumbersome, inefficient and corrupt bureaucratic machine. Sometimes little things can slip through. Igor ended up working on drafting a piece of legislation that would, if passed, grant free access to classified case files. He plans on trying to get it to the State Duma via elected Yabloko representatives in a regional parliament. Realistically, though, his chances of success are tiny. But the legislation he is proposing is a form of resistance that is safe because it's indirect. And he also knows that the legislation will be ready and waiting if the regime in Russia were, one day, to fall. Igor maintains that this is not just a futile gesture, an initiative that will never get off the ground, or one that will be laughed at by Putin's lawmakers.
I still have hope. If I didn't, I probably wouldn't be doing this. And I truly believe that there are plenty of reasonable people in the government, in the ministries, in the leadership who understand what's going on. There's actually a lot of space to get things done. You just have to do the work and keep trying. And even if something doesn't work out now, it won't disappear. It will still be there, and we'll be able to come back to it in the future.
State pressure closes many doors, but sometimes it also pushes people to find new ones. In the realm of family history, as in the other areas we explore in other episodes of our podcast, we see how resistance takes many different forms. It may be less direct, more complex, but is often deeply creative, and it continues to evolve. In our next episode, we'll turn to schools, from major cities to small villages in Siberia. We'll speak with history teachers who are navigating pressure on the curriculum and the rewriting of textbooks. How do they manage to stay honest with themselves and with their students? What does it mean to teach history in Russia today? You've been listening to the Russia Underground podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a comment or a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And please share the podcast with a friend or colleague who you think might enjoy it. We appreciate your support. Until next time, I'm Howard Amos. Thanks for listening.